Have you ever felt like you genuinely don't fit in? Not because you're quirky and no one gets you. I mean that the world itself doesn't seem to support who you are. This is what I call a moral wound. It says that who you are is not made for this world and this world is not made for you. And in some ways it's true, but in others it's not. And it's crucial to understand the difference. And this is what we're exploring today. This video is divided into 3 sections: the whale, the cow, the human. And in part 3, I share with you some of the moral wounds I've observed. Let's go. A few years ago, I read a book entitled Becoming Wild: How Animal Cultures Raise Families, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace by author and ecologist Carl Safina. In the book, Safina travels to the island of Dominica to learn about sperm whales, treks into the remote jungles of Peru to observe macaws, and finds himself face to face with our closest animal relative, the chimpanzee, in the forest of Uganda, asking a simple question: how do animals become wild? He said the natural does not always come naturally. Many animals must learn from their elders how to be who they were born to be. His question led him to whale researcher Shane on the Caribbean island of Dominica. Together they journeyed onto open water, tracking the area's sperm whale populations, while Shane explained the family groups, their challenges and triumphs, and generally how they work and live and bond in their great blue world. It occurred to Safina how vastly different his and Shane's experiences were from the historical observations of whales. He declared that throughout history, man had seen everything, all of the uses, the fears and the myths, everything but the whale itself. Years ago, a journalist by the name of Johann Hari set off on a global quest to get to the bottom of the causes of depression. So he went to interview a South African psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Derek Summerfield. Dr. Summerfield happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when they first introduced chemical antidepressants in the country. Dr. Summerfield told him that the local doctors, the Cambodians, had never heard of antidepressants. And so they were like, what is it? After he explained, they said, we don't need them. We already have antidepressants. What do you mean? Dr. Summerfield asked. He thought they were going to talk about some sort of herbal remedy, but instead, Hari explains, they told him a story. They explained that there was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. One day, he stood on a landmine and lost his leg, so they gave him an artificial one, and after a while he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently, it's incredibly painful to work with an artificial limb underwater and incredibly traumatic to go back and work in the field where there was a bomb. The man started to cry all day. He refused to get out of bed. He developed all the symptoms of classic depression, and the Cambodian doctor said, this is when we gave him an antidepressant. Dr. Summerfield asked, what was it? They explained that they sat with him, they listened to him, they realized that his pain made sense. One of the Cambodian doctors, talking to the people in the community, thought, hey, if we bought this guy a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was causing so much grief for him. He wouldn't have to go back and work in the rice fields. And so they bought him a cow. Within a few weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Throughout his journey and in all of his research, Hari was led to a poignant realization. He said, if you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not crazy, you're not in the main a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. Okay, so what does a whale and a cow have anything to do with moral wounds? Well, a lot actually, because for many of us, when we have moral wounds, we feel like that whale, right? We feel like the story of the whale makes sense, that people see everything about us except us, ourselves. And that when we try to reach out, when we try to actually get to the bottom of what's going on, we run the risk that the story of the Cambodian farmer illuminates. And that is that we might be given a chemical antidepressant versus a cow when we really need the cow. In other words, we need a solution to the true problem. But if the people around you can't see you, if they see everything but you, it can lead to those exasperated feelings of isolation, of not fitting in. And as we grow, we may find that we need to address these things so that we can begin to close those gaps and find that cow, or discover we can let the problem go altogether. There were really three main ways these moral wounds sort of revealed themselves in my childhood. The first one was being born into a wisdomless environment. The second one was being put into situations outside of my capacity. And the third one is the inappropriate use of reinforcement, meaning to be positively reinforced for negative things and negatively reinforced for positive things. So the first one, being born into a wisdomless environment, I was sitting at my computer a few months ago when I just felt, I don't know if this ever happens to you, but I was just filled with so much sadness because I could just feel, wow, being born into a wisdomless environment is truly a traumatic experience because there is a part of us who is desiring to grow, to expand, and there is nothing around us that wants to support us in that way, right? So here's an example of how this wound sort of affected me. I remember once when I was a little girl, I was having issues with other girls at school. And so I went and tried to talk to my mother about it. And she said something along the lines of, oh, they're just jealous. They're idiots. And I remember being like, wow, that's great. Thanks for the unhelpful answer. That tells me nothing. And this is really the essence of this type of wound, is that when you grow up in an environment that cannot actually give you wisdom and guidance on how to be an effective person in the world and cause and effect and why things happen and how you might navigate them for the best results, when you don't have that and yet you desire that, there's a part of you that knows that that's missing, it can create a wound that says, I don't get to have what I need in order to be who I am. That the people around me don't see what I see, don't care to know what I know, and don't have the answers I need in order to help me make sense of my experience. And that can be really detrimental for a young person, because if that happens enough over time, you can give up. You can give up trying to know. You can give up trying to learn. You can give up trying to discover, because you can send out those signals, and if they never get received and reciprocated, it can lead to sort of an apathetic hopelessness. So the second moral wound was being put in situations that were outside of my capacity. And this could be being exposed to movies, being exposed to environments, being exposed to situations that were really not kid-friendly, that were beyond something in which I had a place and a purpose there. So here's an example. When I was younger, I don't know how old I was, maybe 11 or 12, my mother took me and other children down to Bourbon Street. If you haven't heard of Bourbon Street, it is like the wild street in New Orleans. And this was Mardi Gras time, which means it was extra crazy. So we were downtown, drunk people everywhere, crazy stuff everywhere. And here I am, this young girl, painfully aware that I shouldn't be there. The amount of shame I experienced was terrible because I was caught between my mother is saying I should be here and then seeing the other adults around me, feeling them basically saying you shouldn't be here. What a horrible position to be in. I couldn't relate to these adults. There was nothing for me to do there. I couldn't drink. I couldn't party. All I could do was trail my mother and feel the negative gazes of others. Well, I wish that was all that happened that day. But when I was following my mother through the French market, a drunk man came up to me and grabbed like my little bra strap and said, why are you wearing this? You don't need this. So not only was I put into an inappropriate situation, I was literally put into harm's way. It felt like I was being punished, having to suffer the consequences for being in an environment that I didn't want to be in the first place. Situations like this can lead us to moral wounds. Why? Because there is a part of us that knows right from wrong, and yet the people around us don't seem to know or don't seem to care. And they're willing to put us into precarious situations, us into the path of punishment for their own self-serving interests. That can tell a young person that your capacity doesn't matter, that your developmental needs don't matter, your sense of what's appropriate doesn't matter, and that can really set you up for a life overriding your own instincts to serve the, desires of others. And it's not a good thing at all. And it generally made me feel that I was not worth being protected, being considered, or that my instincts weren't right. right. Because if they were right, then people would listen. The third moral wound is the inappropriate application of reinforcement. So this is sort of similar to the previous one, but this is really when we are rewarded for bad behavior and punished for good behavior. So for me growing up, it seemed like my mother, she didn't care if there were boys over, if there were parties, if there was alcohol, totally fine with her. Loved it, would make the rounds. But all of the things that I truly wanted, like I wanted to go to space camp. I wanted to be a little scientist. I wanted to go and explore and do all of these things. That stuff, not so much. Not of interest, doesn't matter. And it created this sort of wound that what I think is right, the world rejects. And what I reject, the world thinks is right. How terrible is that? That your essential goodness, your essential innocence is by default threatened and accosted and attacked. And yet everything that would seeks to defile you and destroy you is propped up. And this can be incredibly painful for a young person when you're just trying to make your way in the world, when you're just trying to fit in, have that mirror reflection in the world around you that says, I see you, I hear you, you are effective, you have a positive effect on the world around you. What you put out is received. What other people put out, you receive. You are in the world, right? You are a meaningful presence in this world. But if you're continuously told that what you believe fundamentally, inherently, innately is wrong, is not accepted, is not received, it's like feeling like you're, looking for a light socket to plug in and it just doesn't exist. And it can cause you to just really feel that who you are is not accepted in this world and who you are doesn't fit in. And these are all examples of moral wounds because they have to do with what is right and what is wrong. So many of us have this intrinsicness within us that we know, even from the youngest of ages, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be around these things. And yet, because of how much of the world works in terms of what it chooses to amplify and what it chooses to attack, it can create a sense of overriding those instincts in order to try to adapt, in order to try to fit in. Sometimes I have to revisit some of these things because they can become so subtle and nuanced in how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to the world, especially if you're on social media, because social media is a negative and positive reinforcement machine, right? So in order to really close these gaps, oftentimes it's a process of acknowledging what you really needed at the time and sort of becoming that inner adult for yourself that says, no, your instincts are right. You're right. Doing these things are right. And beginning to test your environment and to test your relationships to see how much more of your true moral self you get to express in the world and how that gets to be received by others. And that's the beautiful thing about being an adult. You get to choose who you want to spend your time with, what things you want to engage in. And you'll find that there are so many other people out there who think like you and who are looking for meaningful things, that there are safe people out there. And one of the benefits of uncovering these moral wounds is that it also helps you to open your eyes to see the people in your life who are safe and those who aren't. Okay, real quickly, I will share with you the story of when I was prescribed antidepressants when I didn't need them. So I can't remember how old I was exactly, maybe 14 or 15 when this happened, but I do remember the day that it happened. I was at a gynecologist appointment. A gynecologist is a female reproductive doctor with my mother. When she exited the room to speak to the doctor came back and started asking me questions about my mental health and how I was feeling. The truth is I had been feeling sad and frustrated and incredibly angry because I grew up in an incredibly dysfunctional and abusive home, mostly at the hand of my mother. The woman doctor did not know anything about my history, my family history, or my experience of abuse. And yet that day she wrote me a script for antidepressants. Yes, instead of being given the cow, I was given the chemicals. But I was wise in my mother's ways at that point, and so I knew what was really happening was that she was experiencing some sort of insecurity or anxiety, and she needed the doctor to see her as a good mother. So she needed to flip the script, the psychological script. She went to talk to the doctor to try to show that she was a good mother and she was suffering and she wanted to help her child. But what was really happening is she was willing to sacrifice me for her own psychological self-serving agenda. She wanted to be the good mother, but in order for her to be the good mother, I had to be the suffering, wounded, and sick child. But I wasn't going to take on that role. It wasn't true. And I wasn't going to accept a lie. I was not depressed. I was having a normal response to being in such a terrible environment around people who wanted to sacrifice me and destroy me in many ways. So while I did try the antidepressant simply to see if it would give me personal relief, I soon realized that it was never going to fix anything, and I wasn't going to pretend like it was. I wasn't going to take on that identity. And so I stopped and began looking for the cow. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Cheers.